In our last video, you learned a little bit about how to just create an array with the declaration, then instantiating it with the new keyword, and how to refer to specific objects, the specific elements within the array. In this video, we're going to go a little bit beyond that and loop through the array, processing every element and showing you how to do a few useful items with arrays. So let's get going. Here's an example of looping through an array. Often we want to process all the elements of an array in order. We usually do this with a for loop. Remember, you've learned both for loops and while loops. A for loop is something that you count exactly how many times you're going to go through it. Since you know how big an array is, a for loop works pretty well with an array. So down here in red, here's an example. The following code asks the user for 10 numbers, stores them in an array called mynums. Let's look at this. First line, int square bracket mynums. That means, Java, give me a variable called mynums that's going to point to an array, each element of which is an int. Then the rest of that line equals new int 10 means, Java, create me an array that has 10 slots in it. Each slot is an int. And when you're done creating it, wherever you put it, go make sure that the variable mynums knows where that is. Next, we have our old familiar scanner console equals new scanner system in, because I'm going to be reading from the keyboard. And I do a loop for int I equals 0, I less than 10, I plus plus. You remember the syntax of the for loop. Go through this loop, create a variable called I, start it at 0. As long as I is less than 10, keep going through the loop, and at the end of each time through the loop, add 1 to I. So I'll go through for values 0 through 9. As soon as it hits 10, I leave the loop. 0 through 9, by a strange coincidence, those are exactly what the element numbers in my array are. So inside the for loop, I do mynums sub I. That'll be 0 or 1 or 2 all the way up to 9. Equals console.nextInt. So read the next number that the user types at the console. Now that I've got that stored, let's continue the previous example. Let's say we want to print out all of the numbers. I could put in another loop. For int I equals 0, I less than 10, I plus plus. That's the same for statement I had on the previous page. In this one, I'm going to do system.out.println number I plus 1 is mynums sub I. So it'll say number 1 is whatever was in slot 0. Number 2 is whatever was in slot 1. And it'll finish up with number 10 is whatever was in slot 9. Another example. Sometimes we want to process the elements of the array and we have to compare them to something that's not in the array. Suppose of all of the numbers that somebody typed in this example that we've done on the past 2 pages, I want to find out what's the biggest one. Instead of printing out all 10 of them, I want to be able to say just print out the largest number. So if I entered 2, 4, 100, minus 12, 23, negative 17, I'd want to print out the 100 because that's the biggest number. So how am I going to do this? Well, if I go through a loop that looks at every one of the elements, and each time I see one, I say, are you the biggest one that I've seen so far? If you are, I'm going to remember you. If you're not the biggest one I've seen so far, forget you. I'll just remember the one that I previously did. So if, say, my numbers are negative 3 and 5 and 2, when I process the array, I first see a negative 3. That's the biggest one I've seen so far because I've only seen one, so I'm going to remember it. Then I look at number 5. And I say, 5, are you bigger than the biggest I've seen so far? Yes, 5 is bigger than negative 3. So I'll remember the 5. Then I go through the next one. 2, are you bigger than the biggest one I've seen before? No, because the biggest one I've seen before is 5, and 2 isn't bigger than 5. So I keep remembering number 5. How do I do this in Java code? Well, I'm going to keep track of a variable that I'm going to call the biggest so far. You could call this anything. I like to have meaningful names so I remember why on earth I was using the variable. So biggest so far, I need to give it a number that's smaller than any of the ones I'll see in my array. So the very first number that I see in the array is going to be bigger than this one. So I'm giving it a number that's smaller than anything I know I'm going to see, minus 9999999. Then I go through what should now be a familiar for loop for int I equals 0, I less than 10, I plus plus. That's go through all 10 elements of the array, numbers 0 through 9. And I check if my nums I is bigger than the biggest so far, then remember, biggest so far equals my nums I. If it wasn't bigger, then I'm not changing the value of biggest so far. Go through this for loop 10 times, and when I exit the loop, at this point the variable biggest so far contains the largest value found in the mynums array. I could print it out if that's what I need to do. I could use it in a calculation if that's what I need to do. Now let's do another looping example. Suppose I wanted to find the average. I have 10 numbers. How do I find an average? Well, we find an average by adding up all 10 of the numbers and dividing by 10. Now I can do that by saying total equals mynums 0 plus mynums 1 plus mynums 2 plus mynums 3 plus mynums 4 all the way up through mynums 9, and I could write it all out. But that's not really a convenient way to do it. Suppose I had 100 elements in my array. I don't want to write a statement that has 100 things added together, so I'm going to build my total by going through my array one element at a time and say, hey, my total starts at 0, and each time through the array, I'm going to add one more element to it. So when I'm done with my loop that goes through all 10 elements, at that point, my total has the sum of all 10 of the elements. Once I have all 10 of them, I'm going to divide by 10. So I get all 10 elements added up, divided by 10. That gives me the average. What does that look like in code? Here we go. I'm going to keep total is an integer. It's going to start out with a value of 0 because I haven't added anything to it yet. And I'm going to have a variable called average that's going to be a double. Why do I want a double? Suppose my numbers are 1 and 2. The average of that would be 1.5. I'd like to be able to have 1.5 and not lose the 0.5 part. So I'll make my average a double, even though everything else is an int. You should really recognize this for loop by now. Int I equals 0, I less than 10, I plus plus. And inside the loop, all I do is total equals whatever total used to be plus element number I of my nums. By the time I go through this for loop 10 times, my total will now be accurate. And then I can figure out my average. Average equals the total divided by 10. Notice that I cast total as a double so that I don't have to worry about integer arithmetic. Total in its double version divided by 10.0, which is a double. That's going to give me an answer which is a double. Put it in the variable AVG. Now, did you notice how many times in those previous examples we typed in the number 10? What if we changed our mind after we wrote the initial code and decided to include 20 elements in our array? Almost all of the code would be exactly the same, except every place I had a 10, I'd have to change it to a 20. There'd be a lot of places in our code we'd have to change, and I might miss some. So each array has a built-in public variable called length that can be used. Every array knows how big it is. You could say, array, tell me how big you are. That's how far I'm going to go in my loop. So let's see an example. You still have to decide how many elements are in your array at the time you instantiate it. There's no getting around that. So you'd have your int mynums equals, and now if you wanted 20 instead of 10, you'd change this new clause to be new int 20 instead of new int 10. That's the only place you're going to change the 10 to a 20. After that, whenever you want to use the length, like in your for loop, or when you're dividing by the total number of elements to get the average, you aren't going to type in 20 or 10 or any number anymore. You're going to use mynums.length. Let's see how that happens. Here's the exact same algorithm from the previous page on finding the average. Initialize total to 0, give myself a variable called average, that's a double. Now look at how I changed my loop. For int I equals 0, I is less than mynums.length. mynums knows how big it is. It has 20 slots in it. The length is going to be 20. Then I'll do total equals total plus mynums I. Notice that didn't have to change. And then my average is the total divided by the length.